What's up, designers? Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to begin our next project. Now, I know we haven't really gotten too much farther into our line drawing beyond just kind of dipping our toe into the digital space. I promise we'll come back to this design. Let's actually take a step forward and begin to think about our next project, our cut paper project. For that, we're going to need to start working with our black construction paper. But before we even begin to talk about shapes or any new tools or any new processes, it's a really good idea to begin our studio time with another drawing exercise. Flip to a fresh page in your sketchbook and let's pull out one of our pens, one of our drawing pens. You can choose whether you want to use the rolling ball or the felt tip. I'm going to use a little bit larger Sharpie so that it's easier for you guys to see what I'm doing here in the video. So anytime we begin work in the studio, it's always good to sort of begin with some sort of generative exercise. Let's not get down to the pragmatics. Let's not get down to talking about tools and techniques. Design class, after all, is a time to get your mind flowing as freely as possible. So very much like our first drawing exercise, this is not necessarily about coming up with great design. It's mostly about getting your brain to think about design quickly. So let's begin with another 3-shape composition, and the shapes that we use this time are squares. Make 3-shape compositions, 3 square compositions that fill the page, and work as quickly as you can. These exercises are just really good at kind of loosening me up and getting me to think more about the way pens move on a page, or more about the way shapes fit into each other and butt up against each other. With one of these exercises under our belt and my mind starting to kind of work with shapes already, let's get some paper out and begin our cutting project. You're going to need your black construction paper, and you'll find that in the folder that went to your home studio. You should have 2 pieces in there. Just grab one. You're also going to need some tools from your art kit. I'm going to use a nice soft pencil for this demonstration so that you can see, but if you use your 6H pencil, your lines will be very, very light and delicate and hard, where the 4B pencils just show up a little bit easier in the video. You're also going to need your X-Acto blade, and from the front of your sketchbook, we'll use our straight edge, and in the back of your sketchbook, we'll use the cutting board. Now, I've got a nice large cutting board here that I'm going to use in the video, but you'll be using the one that's built in to your sketchbook. So to begin working with shapes, we're actually going to kind of double dip into sort of a little bit of design theory. We're going to use shapes that we more or less freehand cut from here, but we're going to use a design system, a 1-inch base system that we can sort of copy right off of our grid here. So when I say freeform, I don't mean we're going to come up with whatever designs we want. We're going to use sort of an underlying organizational design scheme, and that scheme is going to be that every shape that we use, every geometric shape that we come up with on this piece of paper, is going to be based on a 1-inch unit. If you want to follow along with my exercise here, I'll give you an example of what that might look like. But as long as all the geometry that you kind of come up with in this piece is based on these same 1 inches, you'll find that later on when we work with them, they start to kind of have a bit of agreement with them. Let's work together on this one, and I'm going to carefully line up my piece of paper with the grid on my cutting mat. I've got it aligned vertically and horizontally so that when I lay my straight edge in alignment with all of these lines, I can actually get perfect 1-inch measurements and also nice perpendicular geometric lines. So the first line that I'm going to make on my design here, I'm going to line up my straight edge 1 inch up from the bottom, and once I'm confident where I am, I'll lay a line across. Now, drawing graphite, drawing sort of a dark drawing media onto black paper, you shouldn't be able to see it, but because of some of the other kind of qualities of graphite, it's a highly reflective material, these graphite lines are going to stand up off the page and actually look kind of like a light gray to you. Now that I've got a 1-inch line here, I'm going to come up and do a second 1-inch line, and I'll go up and do a third. Okay, now before I get any higher, I'm going to start to do some work dividing these lines. In this bottom row, let's divide that row in half and divide my lines. I should have the same number of inches on either side. Now this top row here, I'm going to divide into more than just halves. I'll divide it into quarters. So I'll carry that halfway mark straight up, but this time I'll divide my halves into half. To make the best use of our mats, I want you to pay attention to not only the grid lines that you'll see screen printed onto these mats, but also the dot patterns that are on them as well. The dots on your mat should be similar to mine, dividing these half-inch markings into tenths. Count the number of dots to find the exact half. And then for this row, we'll divide it not into quarters, but eighths. So in a really basic way, we've taken what should be a fairly simple kind of mathematical, or you could even call it kind of like a basic problem of measuring, dividing something into half, quarters, and eighths, and we've turned it into sort of a practical exercise of actually measuring those out. Be as precise as you can here. I know the mats aren't super easy to read around the edges, but getting in the habit of reading and measuring and translating it to actual measurements will be really handy throughout the semester. I'm going to make one more full 1-inch row on the top, and then my next row, let's make 2 inches, and the next row, let's make 1.5 inches. And we'll start to divide these up with diagonals. So I'm going to carry my halfway mark straight up through both of these top 2 rows. And on this bottom row, I'll lay in a strong diagonal from corner to corner. I'm going to leave these 2 boxes, those sort of large size, and this time I'm going to make a very skinny row. I'll do another 2-inch row. I'll carry up my quarter divisions. And I'll divide some of these 2-inch squares. Each one of these shapes as I start to get more and more complicated with my geometries is still, remember, based on sort of a 1-inch guide, so that at least one of the sides is always a multiple of 1 inch, either a half of that inch, something straightforward, or 1 or 2. Once you've got the sheet completely filled with geometric shapes with a 1-inch base, let's come back to your art kit and grab your X-Acto blade. Now keep in mind that the X-Acto blades that I've given you guys are really, really sharp. They've got a steel blade in the top that's been ground to a razor edge, and that razor edge is plenty sharp enough to cut the paper. It's also plenty sharp enough to cut you. So if this is the first time you've used a blade like this, or you're not super comfortable, it's not a bad idea to keep a Band-Aid around in the studio just in case. What we'll do though is, similarly to how you just used a pencil to draw straight lines, we're going to use an X-Acto blade to cut straight lines. I recommend to use the razor blade to actually pull towards you, because it's a very controlled way to pull that X-Acto blade. If you start it just as though you were going to start a straight line, just past your paper's edge, run it right along the edge of the plastic guide and pull that towards you, it's a very controlled cut, and that should happen in an incredibly smooth way. If it's looking really rough, you may have accidentally flipped the blade over and tried to cut it with the dull side. It sounds kind of silly, but actually the dull side is plenty sharp even to cut paper. If you're trying to sort of make that cut and follow those old Boy Scout rules, right? Never cut towards yourself, but cutting away from yourself. The likelihood that you'll either damage the straight edge or jump the track and cut yourself is pretty good. So I want you to kind of get in that habit. Hold it as if you were making a straight line with a pencil, very lightly in your hands. Line up the X-Acto blade and the straight edge right where you drew your graphite lines. And if it doesn't cut through in one pass, you can always go back for a second pass, just as if you were trying to make the line darker. And before long, you'll have your entire sheet broken down into all of the shapes that you made. So once you've broken down your piece of paper into all these tiny little bits, you're going to need a place to store it. And your sketchbook doesn't really have a great place to store it. So go back to that folder, and in there somewhere, find a small white envelope. You should have 2 of them. They're sort of tall, skinny, about a half full sheet. These are going to be a great place for you to store all those tiny cut paper images. Use these envelopes to store all those tiny shapes that you otherwise might lose. So a good way to travel with this piece is just to store it in that front page envelope. I'll see you guys in the studio for the next step in this process.